Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first of our ConCave lecture series entitled Questioning Disciplinary Foundations. With this series, we hope to address the biases that have perpetuated systemic blind spots in the canon, and more specifically in the fundamental structures of our architecture curriculum. We hope to look at these biases from the frameworks of racial, gender definition, and ableist critiques, and we'll cap this series with a roundtable discussion in April, and we'll let you know more about that. You are all welcome. Now, before I actually introduce our speaker today, I'd also like to sort of announce we are very proud today to be able to say that we have finally received the book, the proceedings from our previous ConCave symposium from last spring called Divergence in Architectural Research, and we are very happy to announce that it is now here and available for anybody who would like to peruse it. And again, we thank all the contributors, some of whom I know will be listening in on this lecture. We thank all of the participants, not only of the symposium, but the contributors to this book. It has been really a wonderful and enriching experience for both Heidi and I to have worked on this throughout the year. Now, today, it is my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Charles Davis, who is Assistant Professor of Architectural History and Criticism at the University of Buffalo in New York. And Professor Davis's research investigates the role of racial identity and race thinking in architectural history and contemporary design culture. He is the author of Building Character, the Racial Politics of Modern American Style, in which he investigates the paradigm of architectural organicism in 19th century American architecture from the standpoint of race and style theory. As well, he is a contributor and co-editor with Mabel Wilson and Irene Cheng of the recently published Race and Modern Architecture, A Critical History from the Enlightenment to the Present. His current book project, Nonstop, is a tentatively entitled Black by Design, an interdisciplinary history of making in modern America, and seeks to recover the overlooked contributions of Black artists and architects in shaping the built environment from the Harlem Renaissance to Black Lives Matter. Now, in extending our invitation to Professor Davis, our hope was that his research and his insight would be a wonderful catalyst for our discussions in the School of Architecture and amongst the Ph.D. cohort here. We are indeed grateful and very honored, not only that he accepted this invitation, but that he also offered to extend his current research and engage a structural analysis of how one might support racial identity and specifically Black activism within American architecture schools. So with that, I ask you to kindly help me to welcome Professor Charles Davis.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And thank you both for the invitation to come speak here with you. I'm going to share a file and then speak to you for a little bit on what it is that I'm thinking about currently. So this talk is really designed to interrogate what I've been viewing as a space of isolation for Black activist scholarship within the Architectural Academy. Since we're in a moment of reckoning and reconfiguring, I wanted to both talk about this ironic placement of the Black academic and the Black activist within the Architectural Academy, and think about the ways that perhaps a broader sense of urgency that we're experiencing now could motivate us to change that position and that placement. But in order to do so, I find that I have to actually zoom out to look at both the national and international politics that influence and frame the Architectural Academy. So for a good portion of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the ways that American liberalism and American democracy tends to give all of its subjects, including academics within the Architectural Academy, the sense that they are an exception to the way that race tends to operate around the world. And this notion of exceptionalism has served as a kind of burden and obstacle to the ways that we would actually go about starting to and trying to reform the Architectural Academy. So this image I'm showing you here is an image created by Titus Kaffour, and he's a fine artist and a painter, among other things, who helps us to try and appreciate the ways that American representations of our leaders and our leadership creates a mythological veil that preserves the myth origins, or the origin myths rather, of our nation by covering over some of the inconvenient truths about our country and what it represents. In this particular image, we're looking at an image of Thomas Jefferson, and unfurled from this particular painting, we can see the peekings out of another image of another person, being Sally Hemings. And in this narrative about Jefferson, a signatory of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, someone who represents not only in American politics, but in the history of American arts and letters, the genius of the American tinkerer, the American designer, the American architect, to shape the public sphere, both through his construction and design of the University of Virginia, emulating some of the high Roman architecture's history, and also through his own house, Monticello, which serves as a laboratory for neoclassical architecture throughout time. And so we tend to look at people like Jefferson, Washington, other founding fathers as people who set out the principles by which American democracy continues to progress today. But we tend not to be able to write into that story the disruptive ways that the legacies of slavery, of Indian genocide, of continued police violence and oppression continue to upset this narrative. And so for me, I think that instead of reading this as one narrative or the other, it's very productive to understand it as a dual narrative that is simultaneously operating in this context. And this is the context within which American architecture schools have to situate themselves. So at one level, there's a post-colonial narrative that tends to undergird how it is that we think about American democracy popularly. This is the narrative that the nation were a set of colonies, 13 original colonies. They labored under a system of political influence without representation and decided to revolt against their European masters to establish an independent state. And in this narrative, we tend to think about the arrival of European settlers as the beginning or origin point of the nation. The Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, as a kind of inaugural event within this, the cleansing of the frontier and the making way for manifest destiny, along with the actual American Revolution as the founding of the nation state and the establishment of its primary principle. On to that story, we tend to then talk about the eventual dissolution of slavery and the expansion of the franchise of voting and other rights of American citizenship to non-white members, and starting with women and moving on to other forms of difference within our culture. This is the popular story we like to tell ourselves about the American nation. But what's interesting and ironic is that this very narrative, the narrative of the post-colony, resisting European colonialism, is the same narrative that constitutes the settler colonial narrative of American imperialism. And so at the same time that America is a democracy, or at least as was established, a pro-slavery democracy for certain peoples, traditionally white male landowners to have rights as equal citizens, it also operated as an imperial regime. And as an imperial regime, it thought about itself within a landmass between the Atlantic and the Pacific as being the forebear of Western civilization, spreading it westward as it came across the continent. And this notion of American imperialism and the ways that US global power from the continent spread out into the Pacific through certain types of protectorates and land territories, and through its international politics and the way that it conducted itself on the global stage, whitewashes then the oppression that's rendered by the governing structure of the US. And we can go back as far as 1872 to see the seeds of this. And this is the image of a painting entitled American Progress by John Gast in 1872, where it shows us literally in pictorial form the westward migration of Western civilization, coming across the Atlantic, hitting the east coast of the United States, and then spreading westward through the taming of the frontier into the American prairie. And I've drawn a circle around the Native Americans who seem to be fleeing the allegory of progress floating above the landscape in the ways that Patrick Wolfe and Lorenzo Veracini talk about the literal and symbolic replacement of the native subject that was required for the establishment of a settler colony. And so for me, there are some interesting simultaneities happening here. We have this notion of American thrift, this notion of manifest destiny, that all leads to the firm establishment of American democracy. At the same time that we understand America as a settler colony, replacing the native, literally and symbolically, as we see here in this image, and the tools by which they do this. So we see that the technologies of the railroad or the iron horse, the technologies of telegraph and later electric power across the nation, technology being the thing that helps us to move into the future, and the relative parallels that we see technology operating within the avant-gardes of culture. All of these are established in nascent form in this 19th century image. So in this worldview, the White House then, as an architectural example and legitimation of what America is supposed to be, it must represent always and for all time liberty, regardless of its settler colonial origin. And within this discourse, any failure of the American liberal project must be seen as a temporary obstacle towards the perfecting of our union. So this idea of the American democracy being a universalist project presides. And within that worldview, any dissenting notion of the failures of this project is seen as anomalies, not as representative of the primary characteristics of the system. One of the things that we often tell ourselves and that we often use is the language of minority subjects, and in this case, some of the words of Martin Luther King Jr., who has come to represent in the post-war period the labors of the civil rights movement to continue to perfect the upward and forward trajectory of American liberalism. And people from President Obama on through American history have used this phrase to support this notion, saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But I ask you to contemplate, at least for the time that we're here, the question of what if this image of American liberalism is wrong? What if the arc of American history does not bend towards justice, but it actually is a different kind of system? Here's another quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that we tend not to popularize as much, but that was important in his own development of understanding inequality in the US. He said that capitalism does not permit an even flow of economic resources. With this system, a small privileged few are rich beyond conscience, and almost all others are doomed to be poor at some level. And since we know that the system will not change the rules, we are going to have to change the system. So what kind of systemic changes was he talking about? Was it just in reference to capitalism? Was it in the ways that capitalism has written itself within democracy? Was it in the ways that democracy itself parades and continues a system of governance that perpetuates this kind of inequality? I think that we should ask ourselves and seriously consider the possibility of this question. What if American liberalism is not fundamentally a post-colonial experiment in liberty and freedom, but a settler colony established to maintain the privileges of those whom can best assimilate its image of whiteness? Within this kind of national context, what role do institutions like architecture play and architectural education play in maintaining this notion of American democracy? For a long time, I think that architectural educators, and primarily white liberals who practice within the Architectural Academy, thought of themselves as purveyors of freedom. There are many books that talk about democratic architectures and the types that are produced within the United States specifically, but also this notion that somehow an avant-garde situated in the United States is an avant-garde that automatically perpetuates certain types of liberatory practices. If the architecture is formally inventive and therefore in advance of the norms that we see in society, and if being placed within an American institutional context assumes that we are trying to advance the properties and characteristics of liberty and freedom, then the ideology, both political, social, and cultural, within the Architectural Academy in America seemed to be an exception to the types of European colonialisms that we critiqued around the world. But what if that isn't true? What if it's just another version of that form of colonialism, a settler colony established to maintain the privileges of whiteness while whitewashing the inequalities that are inherent in that space? Then we'd have to look at figures that we tend to look at as evidence of the benevolence of this system and reassess what that means. Figures like Julian Francis Abel, who we see here, photographed with the Architectural Society as being included in and formally considered equal to the white members of his space. What does that inclusion mean in a settler colonial context? Is it anything to do with the types of cultural projects he wanted specifically for his own people, African Americans, living in a colonial, in a subject condition within a settler colony? Or is it more representative of the gleaning of talented Black creators to come into a predominantly white space and to continue to reaffirm and legitimize the benevolence and the plurality of that kind of ideology? If it is the latter, then what is required to make institutional change in this kind of political context? And this is what I want to both characterize and to get us to think about here. And I'd like to think about it both in terms of what I'm presenting to you and the argument that I'm making, but also in terms of a kind of debate and an expansion on these ideas that we're having. So what I'm trying to convey to you here is that the African American activists, not only them as a specific group, but minority activists within the American Academy, being members of a settler colonial context, are put into a confining bind. They are included to prove infinite perfectibility of systems like American liberalism, but then isolated by the fact that American liberalism continues to operate as a settler colony that preserves and maintains, at this point, at the unconscious and structural levels, the forms of white privilege that tend to make this difficult. And so, as token members of the Architectural Academy, they're here to show that white liberals and their governing system is benevolent, but never given enough space to truly make the kind of institutional change that would promote equity within this institution and would advance the types of cultural nationalist projects that would help African Americans specifically. So I suggest that we actually promote certain types of activities of reform within architectural education in order to better enable these types of minority subjects. And I'm thinking specifically today about Black activism within the Architectural Academy to thrive and to prosper? The first thing that we need to do is we need to properly identify and critique the types of racism that operate at the heart of American imperialism and study the patterns of oppression and erasure these projects promote onto the nation's institutions. Now, some of this project has to do with thinking much broader in terms of the role of American politics in general, but we could even use architecture as case studies in how to understand this. So historical scenes of the ruins of American architecture, like the ones we see here, at the top of the White House after the War of 1812 with the British, and at the bottom, after or during, rather, insurrection at the US Capitol. These moments that seem to either be exerting pressure against the growth of American democracy or showing and revealing the inherent paradoxes and complexities of American democracy. To me, these are touchstones and touch points that we can use to complicate what the language of American democracy and American architecture. In the volume Race and Modern Architecture, there are several very good essays that talk about this, from Mabel Wilson and Reinhold Martin's discussion of Thomas Jefferson himself and the ways that his Neo-Palladian philosophy of architecture helped to erase, both literally and symbolically, the presence of African Americans and African slaves in that space, so that white subjectivity and the performativity of white identity could happen in splendid isolation. So the splendid and disinterested autonomous analysis of form that allows us to just look at Jefferson's Monticello and the White House as these kind of neoclassical objects of beauty were predicated on the erasure of Black subjectivity, Black labor, Black presence. But at the same time, I think that moments like the Capitol insurrection, they bring into high relief the types of Americanisms that simultaneously operate within our politics, the ones that we tend to whitewash and paper over in order to talk about the United States of America, as many politicians discuss, without fully addressing and structurally reforming the white supremacist and white cultural nationalist basis of much of American architecture as it is currently understood in our time period. So in terms of this national history, we need to and must acknowledge the patterns of settler colonial governance that constituted our historical wealth. This means understanding that there was a timeline before Europeans arrived in the United States. And we need to account for that history, both socially, culturally, but also in terms of the material cultures that they produced, their relationship with the landscape, and the fact that Native Americans are not gone, they're here. They're sequestered in reservations. They're still fighting for a kind of visibility at this very moment in time. It is not a historical problem. It's a present problem. It's a problem of racial justice. It's a problem of economic justice. From contemporary debates about pipelines running through Native American reservations to what level of sovereignty Native Americans should have, either as tribes, which makes them seem like they are subordinate to the sovereignty of the U.S., or as sovereign nations that stand on an equal ground and equal footing with the United States. But then, by implication, it also means recovering transatlantic and trans-Pacific histories of migration omitted from our canonical history, especially as these communities offer competing visions of national identity that have yet to be recorded. So if we think about this in terms of our history of the US, of American democracy, you can look at the image in the top right, the image of immigration that we tend to refer to and to use as our reference point, which are the initial waves of European settler migration to the United States, and the ways that this narrative overwrites other forms of transatlantic migration, like the US slave trade, and the ways that this was part and parcel of the economic and intellectual migration of goods and services. But even before that, in the image on the right, the form of migration that came not from the east to the west, but from the west to the east in terms of the migrations of Native Americans from Asia across the Bering Strait down the south west and southern boundaries of what is currently known as Canada, the United States, Central America, and South America. And so contemporary genetics research, contemporary anthropology is helping us to restore what those cultures were like, both in material form and also in terms of the spiritual cosmology. Writing this back into the story of American history is important. And as you can imagine, the same arguments now can be made for the Eurocentric discourses that structure our knowledge of architecture. In the field of architecture, this means a shift in our focus from the symbolic inclusion of elite, non-white subjects who assimilate the notion of whiteness that is dominant into our field, which expands this conservative notion of diversity and inclusion by sidestepping the very radical notions of equity, which not only allows certain privileged members into closed, distinguished groups, but provides the structural basis by which most people of that cultural group can act upon the built environment and create it and shape it the way that they want to for themselves in reference to their own needs and desires. So this means that whenever we talk about the issue of diversity and inclusion in architecture, we no longer simply talk about how many Black architects have we licensed, which is a symptom of the problem at the core of our curriculum, of the ways that whiteness is preserved in this space. And instead of insisting that the individual Black subject assimilate into this space and try and figure out more ways of allowing for that process of assimilation, which, as settler colonial theorists talk about, is a form of cultural erasure to occur, what can we do to then change the core of what we teach that we will then see a subsequent influence in by the inclusion of other members themselves? So when we look at these numbers, the lesson we should come away from is that people are self-selecting not to enter architecture, whether it's at the level of joining an architectural program or staying with the profession through licensure, because there are other ways that they can act upon the built environment that fall outside of what we currently look at as the disciplinary privileges and aims of architectural production. It means being forthright about the racial politics of our discipline, acknowledging that the aesthetic standards of monumental architecture and the definition of the architect, as we now know it, are based almost exclusively on European definitions of art, and primarily definitions of art that historically emerged during periods of European colonialism and nationalization. And if we understand the relationship between the ways that European nationalism and artistic cultures are concomitant with one another and legitimize one another, then we will question the political purposes to which architecture's tools today can be used to actually liberate those who find themselves subject in these settler colony contexts. It means thinking about the ways that Enlightenment definitions of architecture continue to artificially stratify the intellectual and physical labor of buildings. Peter Minoche has a wonderful essay in Race and Modern Architecture that talks about the ways that the intellectual labor of the Capitol building on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., which was produced by a white subject, erases the Black labor that was used to produce and actually literally construct that building. That includes both unskilled and skilled labor in the building practice. And this paradox of needing to erase contributions of Black labor in order to produce a physical emblem of liberty and freedom in American democracy is something that is constitutive of the way that our nation is produced, not an anomaly of it, but helps us to understand the double movement that is occurring in America and its artistic institutions. Yet these cultural biases remain invisible because we continue to label European standards of art as universal principles of art. And we continue to whitewash the histories of architecture by normalizing this exclusive system of power. In the kind of context that I'm talking about in terms of the isolated role of the Black activist subject within the Architectural Academy, we do this in two ways. One is in the creation of inclusive histories of architecture, which tends to glean the most monumental works from different cultures from around the world, including works contributed by African Americans in the United States through the expansion of HABs, roles, preservation roles, and the like. What this does is that it preserves the intellectual and disciplinary core of architecture, which I argue is compromised by its whiteness and its historical origins of being a tool of white colonialism and white supremacy around the world, instead of revising that core space. And within Black communities, we also see that this narrative it takes the form of a kind of bootstrap narrative, that even in a racially oppressive and divisive context, Black subjects have shown themselves to have the fortitude to be included in this space. Paul Revere Williams, Robert Robinson Taylor, and Julian Francis Abel are three examples of this kind of discourse. And this is what's held out and literally codified and taught at high schools all around the nation to encourage Black children to enroll in architecture, give them their heroes, without giving them the sense that they shouldn't have to suffer in the same ways that these heroes suffered, but that the profession should shift and change, and is shifting and changing, to welcome them as new members and new adherents. So I argue that instead we must institutionalize, through changing the curriculum, a steady critique and revision of the European pedigree of disciplinary definitions of the architect, or the person in charge of all of this work in the built environment, and architecture, or the types of objects that we dignify with that label, that continue to structure knowledge in our field. And I think that intellectually, this means connecting the Black activist scholar, who is now currently isolated in this space of reinforcing and demonstrating the perfectibility of American liberalism, to the discourses and the criticisms that exist in post-colonial studies, critical race studies, and other fields within the humanities that already demonstrate and present a critique of American settler colonialism and American imperialism. This opportunity now exists in the resurgence of something called settler colonial theory, which I'm showing you in the middle. This literally builds a bridge between the complex simultaneity of post-colonial studies and settler colonial studies in the US context, which were previously understood to be two separate realities, to the language and analytical tools that are developed in these other fields. And I believe that the Black activist scholar can not only bring this language into the curriculum, but can benefit from the ways that this critical language suggests a reformulation of the curriculum, a steady critique of its Eurocentric biases, alongside a kind of steady production of a new way of understanding the nationalisms embedded within the context. So this means going back to and critiquing some of the canonical histories that we have, from the parochial notions of what American architecture is, established by historians like Fitzkimball, Montgomery Schulier, and others, but also thinking about the ways that American architecture, the national tradition, has also been expanded upon to think about American architectural education as the new geographical locus of an international tradition. And so this idea of the international style coming to New York, moving westward in the same ways that Manifest Destiny and other forms of white Christian ideologies move westward, but then also in the ways that both historical and contemporary avant-gardes tend to reference themselves to some of these originary myths, whether it's the MoMA myth of the international style or the presence of the avant-garde within the West itself, to legitimize their own presence through a disciplinary history that sidesteps the types of difficult and thorny issues of political conservatism and political oppression. And I'm purposefully showing you here the image of Philip Johnson, who has emerged as of late as a figure of controversy again because of the removal of his name from several types of awards, departments, and practices related to the institutionalization of architecture culture. So instead, I think that we must be ready to construct an avant-garde that is predicated on creating an architecture that materializes pan-African forms of nationalism for African American subjects. And clearly, I'm thinking about this specifically in relationship to Black activist scholars. But if we want to think even more broadly, anyone who is in the quote-unquote position of the subaltern subject, the subaltern voice, as described in post-colonial discourses, needs an institutional basis upon which they can start to construct these forms of nationalism. If we really want it to be a discipline that creates radical alternatives to the present, then we won't just focus on form in an autonomous way, but we'll focus on the types of form that present an embodied critique of the political structures that maintain division and oppression in our present. And the Black activist subject could be a representative type of person to lead the way in this. So in this move, in this shift, we transform the Black activist designer from a token in a predominantly white system to a thought leader who shows the way forward in a reformist and potentially even transformative architectural practice. Now we can see some examples of this happening already. There's a show at the Museum of Modern Art, which is entitled Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. Part of both the catalog associated with this and the works shown here demonstrate some of the ways that Blackness and architecture can come together by reforming the disciplinary assumptions of of architecture as a kind of base of knowledge production, and particularly in relationship to MoMA's role in establishing and substantiating this practice. But then it can also have broader forms as well. I think an anti-racist curriculum can be established, but it should be founded on a critique of whiteness in our discipline and an active recovery of non-white voices and perspectives. And if we do both of these things simultaneously, not only are we then stress testing the current foundations of our disciplinary knowledge in terms of what elements, principles, ideas, and concepts should move forward into the future, but also which ones should be relegated to the side, to history, shown to be problematic for legitimizing these forms of hegemonic power. But then secondarily, recovering the types of alternative systems and notions of national subjectivity and personhood that have been currently relegated to the waste bin of history, instead now brought back so that we can contemplate them and think about developing them in the present. This means practically that the faculty and student body must consist of both white and non-white peoples in positions of authority, not just in terms of the old notion of, or the conservative notion of diversity in the sense that we want our leadership to look like the United Nations, but to still operate the way that it does currently, but in terms of actually allowing different modes of architectural production to simultaneously exist. This means fragmenting the hegemonic practices and authority of current Eurocentric discourses to make way for other discourses. Studio instructors must also reject the notion that good design only consists of monumental forms or technological innovation. This means seriously problematizing certain things in our NAB criteria, things like precedent study. What does that mean, and what does it tend to produce? It means questioning the notion that certain schools in the United States become these places or havens for particular avant-gardes that speak about one common language of architectural form, but present a radical alternative in the present that continues to extend that universal language. And it means that histories of architecture must consist of a cultural history of the built environment, broadly speaking, not just a canon of good or monumental works. And in doing so, we make the job of critiquing our profession not just the job of the historian, but also the job of the studio professor. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm going to stop sharing here just so we have time to speak and discuss this as a group, and to even debate some of the issues and ideas that were brought up here.
Thank you, Professor Davis, for your very thought-provoking presentation. We have time, obviously, for questions from the audience, and we'll be happy to moderate. While we have, do we have any questions right now? Heidi, can you tell? I don't see any of my.
We don't have a question yet, but if you have any questions, you can either type it in the chat section, or you can type it in the Q&A section, which is on the bottom of the icons.
So while we wait for people to start to formulate their questions, I have a sort of something I'd like to sort of bring into the discussion, and that's the sort of in this parallel or double work, both of critique and at the same time of active recovery. And I'm thinking specifically in terms of historical subjects, the active recovery of historical subjects. There is the problem of the available evidence, and how do we expand that active recovery and expand that available redefinition of what constitutes actually the historical record, in order to be able to actually reconstruct, rewrite, provide alternative narratives?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good question in terms of both the types of histories that we currently have on people of color and the paucity of those histories. And I think it's a paucity only if we think about history in a certain vein, and only if we think about evidence in a certain vein.
Right.
What I find is that some of the scholars who are working on this actually find that we have a lot of evidence about what minority subjects thought and what they did in the past. And these evidences are not just dependent upon archaeology and like the kinds of physical remains where we have to guess what they were thinking, but especially African American. They have made a part of their cultural identity within the United States to create artworks and material cultures that critique the United States system of governance and create an alternative that presents them as fully humanized subjects. And so this goes from journals that they have and personal recollections, family photographs and stories, to African American literature, poetry, art, music. I mean, there's just so much that different cultural groups in the United States produce that might tell us what they think, what they value, and what they believe, that we'd have to shift our notion of evidence from the things that are related to the architect's practice, the drawings, the bills that they produce, the types of private writings, the speculations that they have, that are really just a really closed and narrow disciplinary history, to an expansive history of the built environment around which certain types of participants, some of whom could not be called architects because of legal segregation, but were patrons of the arts, were contractors and producers of the built environment, that I think gives us a long history. But so I think that this call to include, if we move beyond the term of inclusion, which is like just look for the same types of evidence we typically have, to elevate these non-white peoples to the same level, to radically shifting what architecture is and who the architect is. Now the previous forms of evidence are insufficient because they don't tell us about the ways that politics informed their cultural projects, because we now understand that they were just ways of legitimizing a Eurocentric way of understanding the profession and providing certain privileges within that space. If we do that, then the real debate is, what is architecture? And who is the architect in this context? And to me, like, this was the missing debate from the autonomy debates from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You know, the ways that the cultural reading of heterogeneity and other forms of postmodern subjectivity were elided for a formal reading of what this meant.
Right.
to continue to substantiate the monopoly that some people have. And so I don't think, if I were to say that we have a current like problem with the archive, for me, it's around those figures like Paul Revere Williams, Robert Robinson Taylor, Julian Francis Abel, where we haven't analyzed the kinds of Black subjectivities they brought to the production of neoclassical, predominantly white architectural styles and forms of production. That's something that I never see. What I always see is this narrative of they were able to master the aesthetic language of whiteness. And they were able to fool those. Like people came to Paul Revere Williams' office thinking that he was a white architect because he had, the very American name of Paul Revere Williams. And he was able to produce white architectural styles. But instead of just showing us that, yes, Black people can imitate whiteness. I mean, like, if you look at the history of Blackness, that's clear. Like, in order to exist and to live, there are ways that we have had to mirror whiteness back to white subjects so that we could survive. Mm-hmm. But what forms of Blackness are embedded in that practice? That is where I think the archive is lacking. And that's where I think we lack the critical tools to really understand. And so if we could do that and present these Black subjectivities more fully, then I think that we actually would be on our way to reforming what architectural education is. And I think that, for me, institutionally, I've struggled with whether this should happen in predominantly white institutions that have a lot of the resources and the expertise, but most of the expertise relates to older notions of disciplinary knowledge that I'm talking about, or whether they should be historically centered and institutionally centered in HBCUs or within Black communities, and whether new centers of knowledge production should be established where people with the right sensibility and the right tools for discernment could introduce a new reading of architecture that is really radically different. I mean, I don't really know. It has to do with sort of the willingness of people in charge of current institutions, where money is, what kind of public program and taste program would be required to change what we think of as architecture and include other types of works and cultural productions. I think that's an interesting question. And so for me, I think that at least having the debate could be useful.
Right. Well, this also brings to mind, I see that we also have now some questions popping up, but I just, before we lose this thread, this also brings to mind another issue. We started with this, we started our conversation together with a sort of discussion of books and, just how long these books actually, these fortuitous sort of appearances of these books that, arrive just at the nick of time or at the very right moment, but that they take a long time to produce, to sort of capture the moment. There is also the other issue of the sort of, as you were talking about this, I was thinking about all the mechanisms of scholarly sort of validation, and that those mechanisms are also already have embedded in them a lot of these sort of exclusionary practices, and that we're discussing here, this idea of who decides what the theme of a book is going to be about, who's the kind of the hand that's kind of generating the overall message that's going to come out of as even a compilation, a publication. And so all of this kind of begs the question to me of like, do we need to kind of find new sort of platforms in which that are valid as sort of centers of sort of knowledge creation, production, dissemination, particularly with regard to these these issues of equity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a really good question. I can answer it in one of two ways. So one way is to think about, is it possible for the existing institutions of architectural education to serve as centers of reform? Or is the sense of tradition and the sense of investment in the current structure of how our discipline produces knowledge so great that we would have to produce spaces of new knowledge production outside? And so, if there are any architectural administrators, deans, chairs, people who run these programs, I would put the question to them in this way, right? So when you are looking for a candidate of color to come into your school, what do you want them to do? And what resources do you give them to do that work? So are they the ones who have to maintain the relationship with communities of color from the faculty, and the burden of that change is placed upon them? So they're not only a token and the person that makes you look more diverse, but they have to do all the work. Or is the institution more broadly shifting its attention toward that space, and you're bringing in someone who is a person of color to now produce the worldviews, produce the utopias, produce the architectural works that you cannot produce because you don't have a link to that culture? That latter model means that there's a division of labor, that those who are leading institutions are leading the critique. They're leading the critique of whiteness and showing its insufficiency. They're building new types of resources like new publications, new faculty lines, where the criteria for tenure might be different. They're building literal laboratories for utopian speculation that are built upon what might, be called in conservative circles un-American ideas or un-American practices, like literally trying to undo Americanism as it exists now to make way for other types of practices. I think it would be completely radical for an American School of Architecture to start the Center of Un-American Architectural Production or Research, and to allow for new types of American ideas to emerge. But I think that you can't, and I'm speaking mostly now to like my white liberal friends who don't know what to do, what their role is, right? And especially those who are already tenured, maybe even endowed with endowed professorships or deanships or chairs. They want to be able to do this, but they know that investing in such a discourse, there's a cost to that. Now you're an outsider in the current discourse of the way that architecture is defined, or you have to now work on two fronts. You have to produce an architecture that is still legitimizing that way of looking at the world while experimenting with another. And I think that all of these possibilities seem unreal to someone super invested in the present. The end of slavery seemed unreal. The expansion of the franchise of voting to women seemed unreal until it was done. And so the kind of reform that I'm talking about just requires the will to do it. And given the kind of marketplace of ideas we have, people will self-select to come and participate in that experiment or not. But I think we have enough people who feel like we're on the wrong track that something could be constructed in that space. But right now, publications like Race and Modern Architecture, organizations like Dark Matter University, there are lots of think tanks out here to tell us what the problems are. Right. What I don't see are established institutions stepping up and creating a framework for change. That's what I don't see. And that's what is necessary for this to move forward.
Thank you for that framework for change. We have some questions. Heidi, do you want to read them?
Actually, I would like to start with this question. It's coming from a student who is working to make these kind of changes at their own institution. And the biggest struggle has been finding a way to ensure that these changes will endure. So they're asking, what advice would you give for students mobilizing to create these changes? They have been meeting with faculty and proposed curriculum changes.
So this is a good question. I will add to the question one historical fact, which is that most communities of color and most marginalized groups in the United States operate upon their built environment. They produce changes that are meaningful, culturally resonant, and in some ways, depending on how we look at it, architectural. The real change that we need is to develop a lens within the academy and within the discipline to acknowledge that work. Then we will find that this long history of change that we didn't have before starts to self-populate on its own. Mm-hmm. So for those students who are worried about changing the institution, I would say, take the resources you need to invest in your communities so that you can go and contribute to that making. And don't worry about revising the cultures, within the architectural academies. Like, you're a student. Your job is not to reform those institutions. You're not, in some ways, they're corporations. You're not even granted that authority. Some people take into consideration what students think because of the amount of money they pay for tuition and other things. But if an administrator wanted to, they could strong arm any form of practice that they wanted, and it wouldn't there wouldn't be any legal recompense because they operate as corporations. Most of them are sort of private entities. So in that sense, that's a really steep hill, to climb. Now you could do it, and I'm not saying don't protest when it really matters and when it can introduce very strategic changes to what it is that you want in the curriculum. But I would say do that when you need something for your own architectural project that is not there, and concentrate on your architectural project. Then once that body of work is there and people can talk about it, then it's really about soliciting the attention of an architectural critic, an architectural historian, like a body of architects who are giving awards to acknowledge that work. That's really how you would start to do it. But I think that really the poverty is in the disciplinary language we have to acknowledge what is already happening, not that this thing isn't happening in the world. Like Black people have been making their spaces for years. We just need to figure out what they've done, and we need to document it. And so in that sense, I think you're doing exactly your job by going to architecture school, learning to be a good designer, and then going back to these communities to produce. And then it is the job of those still in the academy to do that. Now, you could do like me, where you did all of that, and then you decided to go back to the academy to reform. Then we're talking about a different question, like what can I do as a faculty member? What can I do as an associate dean or provost of diversity within the university that might help this? But I think that that's a different question. I don't know that students should be responsible for reforming the curriculum. They should be telling faculty what it is that they need to do their work, and then the faculty are responsible for finding people with that expertise to bring them in. So they should be held accountable, and there should be systems of accountability. But I wouldn't put it as a burden to the student, just like I would not put it as a burden on the person of color to be responsible for reforming an institution. I mean, unless you're willing to make us like emperors or whatever, we can just decide whatever, then absolutely. But if that's not what you want, then I don't think those kinds of questions are the most productive way of thinking about it.
We have a question here that I want to follow this with. It's from Anonymous, and it asks, are the new are the new NAB conditions doing more damage? It seems like the roles of history and precedent have actually been reduced, and questions of equity and the disproportionately negative impacts of the built environment on communities of color are not registered within the student criteria.
I think this is a really good question. I remember sort of the last round when history and theory became slightly more prominent, but really sort of student awareness, cultural difference and diversity, and understanding how to design for those contexts was pretty large. And then I think there was a sort of, I'd have to really look more closely at the different drafts that were produced, but it seems to me from the outside that an overcorrection has occurred in terms of training students to be technically proficient with certain forms of manufacturing productions and digital production. And that the reputation and pedigree of certain architectural programs seems to be highly premised on these skill sets and not others. And so to me, it's a kind of positivist turn, and you see that in historical rounds of NAB criteria from, like the areas of the post-war period, 60s and 70s, times when you see the corporatization of architectural practice, and students need to think about what that was. There was a turn at the turn of the century of the paperless office, and people really focusing on those things. And I think that certain schools maintain a kind of link or build a bridge between the ways that architecture was historically thought of as a humanist endeavor that sort of materialized the social and cultural conditions of which it was produced. And this notion of architecture goes back to like this kind of civilizational notion of architecture where the most monumental forms are sort of visual representations of what was most valuable. Now, there are lots of problems with that. There are lots of omissions and coverings of that. But at least within that model, there's a sense that history helps to build a certain level of sensibility and discernment within the mind of the architect that allows them to respond to cultural conditions. And the other is really premised on a kind of technocentric positivist notion of progress that is based on a notion of an avant-gardist practice that produces these wonderful forms that are representative of a future to come and not who we are now. And this artificial split that was key to the avant-garde, I think, is really problematic in our discourse. And I think that it tends to draw a really sharp line between so-called pre-modern or globally South architectural discourses and cultures. We might even call it in the United States the difference between folk architectures and vernacular architectures versus avant-gardist architectures. And it allows for architecture schools to just throw out anything that doesn't lend itself to that practice. So for me, I would agree that part of the NAB criteria institutionalizes and codifies a problematic element of avant-gardist discourse, which is that it is premised on technology and a progressive notion of history. And we seem to keep moving back and forth between these poles instead of understanding how to synthetically integrate them within different types of practices. So I do worry about what this means for a generation of architects as we're waiting for new NAB criteria. And we have architecture schools which may lack the kind of independent leadership. I mean, there are a lot of sort of middle tier and lower tier schools that use NAB to figure out what they should teach, and they don't have the resources to experiment and to produce other forms of knowledge. And so a lot of people now will not have the vocabularies that they need to do this kind of work. And so I think that's a really bad signal to be making at this cultural moment in the US, especially. And so I would encourage people to do what they tend to do in wealthier and more privileged schools, which is you do what you need to do to tick off those boxes, but that doesn't define your curriculum. That doesn't define the projects the cultural projects that you invest in. That's the only check on that I could see within this term.
Following up that answer, we have another question from John Ellis. He's telling us an anecdote that two fellow Georgia Tech students, Jordanian and Cameroonian, were drowned out of their third year in the College of Architecture in 88 and 89. Their non-design grades were good, studio designs were poorly received as not stylish. How can students and professionals stand up to the school and AAI good old boy institutions? And I guess we can also include some professors in this category as well.
Mm-hmm. So to me, the question is it's trying to acknowledge the forms of expertise that these students had in non-design studios that was not acknowledged within design studios. I mean, I find that often occurs, even for the studios that I have taught, if you don't structure the studio in a particular way. For example, when I structure a design studio, and I've seen it structure a design studio for an underrepresented neighborhood, then the expertise of the so-called students of color is common knowledge, collective knowledge. It's during the kind of site study phase of development. And so well, what do you know about this neighborhood? Who lives there? What kind of cultural patterns exist? You know, all the kind of native informant inside knowledge that architects want to have so that they can cherry pick something that then they can aestheticize and produce a nice design. Then when you get to the design phase, all of that social knowledge is thought of as being secondary and to be relegated to and subordinated to more formalist types of gesture. And what I've noticed in my studios is that the students with that kind of knowledge tend to produce spatial solutions and programmatic solutions that are much more nuanced than any other student in the class, just by virtue of knowing what's happening there and being able to explain that. Sometimes they have the aesthetic ability to produce designs that emulate the standards of avant-gardism that we currently have. Sometimes they do not. It can be kind of a crapshoot depending on the individual student and their training. But I think that for me, the way that I've started to go about doing this is that I've tried to formalize other forms of expertise through different types of awards. So there are some design awards that are all about formal innovation, but we've tried to introduce things like the social cultural critique that a student produces, sometimes in a thesis project. Other times there's a kind of like programmatic innovation or landscape innovation that occurs within a project. And if you acknowledge that there are different ways to be a good designer, and that acknowledgement is formal, I mean, like you can put it on your CV. It's a way of building credentials and expertise. Then I think you can help students like that. So if the only design award in your school is best senior project and best thesis project, and the
Right.
criteria is very vague, then there's no way that somebody can come in who is a student and sort of argue for what that should mean. Usually it requires a faculty to do so. And if you have a faculty advocate, you might have someone who's on your side. But if you don't, then that expertise goes away. In order to make that expertise permanent, put those awards in place. Be really explicit about what that criteria is, and then make sure that every year somebody gets that award. That way, it's clear signal to everyone that it's not just about the coolest looking forms and the most sort of inbred discussions about what architectural formalism is in order to be avant-gardist and therefore thought to be good. Now, this is, it's hard for some people to understand though, because like they're trained to think that architectural education is about form, space, and order. And that's the fundamental universal principles. They're not trained to understand these as, principles that grow out of a kind of European diasporic discourse, formalized at the École des Beaux-Arts, that were then passed on into the United States. That's where we get the term precedent from, our understanding of what it means and what it's supposed to do, and that is a colonialist discourse. If we can articulate that, then I think we can divorce some of the assumptions that people have between these ways of thinking, which I think is absolutely crucial for acknowledging other forms of expertise.
Definitely. And to support your argument, John texted, their designs were highly imaginative when the programs were community-oriented, actually. So definitely, I agree with your answer. And we have another question related with the students and, of course, this self-selection, selecting out of architecture. The question is, could you elaborate upon those students who self-selected out of architecture? What do you think are some of the driving factors? In other words, would this be due to a cost-benefit analysis of the fields, current time-intensive pedagogy, and training on the way to licensure?
So I'm aware of a few studies of this, both within the AIA, also within the fields of sociology. I think the fields of psychology also study architects, but they tend to reinforce the hero worship that is there. But in the field of sociology, there's a critique of who tends to go to those and continue along those paths versus who moves out. And so from the AIA, you can get statistics of the level of attrition between people, communities of color, women, and the general population that goes to architecture school. Some of it has to do with just general factors, such as the long period between graduation and when you can get a license and therefore see your financial prospects rise. And for some communities, it's a very good tool for creating a very stable middle class and upper middle class. And those who are born into privilege find themselves being able to borrow upon other types of cultural capital in order to continue to elevate their spaces in that way. When we ask people why they leave the field, very often, besides cost and time and those things that sort of, I could just do better as a lawyer or a doctor or something else, and so it just seemed less investment. Another one that comes from particularly communities of color, response is that I was able to impact my community without having to become an architect. I could use my design skills and expertise problem solving, the way that the architect atomizes very complex problems and develops skill sets to do it, without having to become an architect to shape the built environment, right? So, and this reminds me of sort of like in nations like Italy, where people will go into architecture and then become politicians. And so they have a design sensibility about how to think about the built environment. They also now have access to tons of money in order to shape what that built environment should look like. And I think we write that out of our story because we've been so focused on reinforcing the avant-gardist hero architect as the only figure of note within our discipline. So I think, we lose them in terms of being licensed architects, but we don't lose them in terms of how they think about the built environment. And perhaps if we structure our statistics slightly differently, and the way that we account for the influence and impact of architecture schools, we might be able to recuperate some of the lessons that were lost then. I will say though that like historically, and there's a monograph by Darby English that came out of the MoMA series on redressing the role of blackness at the Museum of Modern Art, that talk about the legal and social, both legal restrictions and social taboos that forced black talented individuals from being architects to becoming artists, graphic designers, interior designers, etc. Noah Purifoy is one of these people. He's somebody who went into design, couldn't find the kinds of clients that would support him, or at least people who believed that their sense of taste was more refined than his sense of taste, and therefore gave him a hard time in what he could do. And so he moved into a parallel field where there was less resistance. I think that that's something that comes into play. And again, I think that that's not a problem with the individual subject. Like we see people self-selecting to go somewhere else because they have to eat and they want to use their skills to have impact. And the staircase in architecture is too high and there are too many holes. And in other spaces, it's a little bit more reasonable from where they come from. And so I think for people from lower middle class and working class spaces without the cultural capital, architecture is a heavy lift. We create obstacles for those people. For people of color who come from very privileged backgrounds, they are able to navigate in ways that we find other people of privilege can navigate. But they have very different views of the world. And so I think we're losing some of the expertise and commentary that we could have that would make us a more pluralistic discipline.
And this is sort of aligned with another question from Felipe Hernandez, who says, but how about professional bodies such as RIBA or the equivalent in the USA, AIA? How can we decolonize that? So, of course, there's that sort of institutional framework that also could be addressed.
I think this is a really complex question because of the term decolonize. So if we think about, for example, decolonizing an institution in a truly post-colonial context, you have a kind of political, social, and institutional basis upon which, newly free subjects can think about what their role is to the previous colonial state and where they want to go in the future. In a settler colonial context, the people who are marginalized in that system are continually oppressed by the settler colony. There is no post-colonial condition. So how can you decolonize when you're in a political situation where you're not free, you're not liberated? So when I'm talking about, for example, like Black activist talent within architecture, I'm thinking about it as a colonial context. And the decolonization that needs to occur is not with people of color who already understand their compromised position, but it's with those who are leading those institutions. And the decolonization that has to then happen is not piecemeal reform, but it's literally saying we need to disinvest from the systems of American imperialism, white supremacy, neoliberalism, racial capitalism that we previously were associated with. So the decolonization there is a mental decolonization that has to happen with the leaders so that they're producing a foundation, an institutional foundation upon which a post-colonial, a truly post-colonial space can be thought of. So what would be the purpose of decolonizing in a partial way an institution that has historically been used to legitimize colonization, except to produce a new form of governance. If it's not to do that, then you're just kind of spinning your wheels, you know? So in that context, I wonder if it would be better to establish another kind of institution. This is why the National Organization of Minority Architects exists, because of this conflict between what the AIA could do with its current cultural projects and commitments and what they could not do. Now saying this, I don't want to say like I can't ever imagine a day when the American Institute of Architects is no longer a colonial space. But when I look at the debates that occurred when Obama left office and Trump came into office, people were talking about, well, is it ethical to contribute to the border wall? The really late pronouncement that maybe we shouldn't build prisons, and maybe that's a kind of ethical no-go within our field. Very conservative, you know, very far behind the curve in terms of how this happens. There seems to be a colonial pressure on architecture and its institutions to maintain its role of legitimizing the paradigms of the settler colony. I don't think we should waste our time trying to decolonize those spaces if the leadership shows no interest in doing that. You know, I think that it would be far more practical to establish other forms of canonizing things outside if we don't see that nod. Now, if we do, then it's a totally different ballgame. But I mean, unless we're talking about like a 10-year, I know that like we saw Georgia flip because there was a 10-year effort to kind of get people to vote, and there's a parallel effort to do that to the AIA so that we can vote in a different kind of leadership. If you can even vote them in, some organizations are appointed, you can't vote them in, then maybe that could help. But that requires a kind of organic bottom-up process. Mm-hmm. And architecture is all about gleaning and bringing people into a top-down authoritarian structure. Structurally, it's just very different. You'd have to change the culture of who joins the AIA, who joins RIVA, and what those things represent and their association with power structures. It just seems easier to create a decolonialized space and to institutionalize those practices there as a counterweight than to try and decolonize the interior of the AIA. But that's just my reading of what I understand that structure to be, and the fact that there's already a Whitney M. Young Jr. Award, there are already Black Fellows within the institution, and it still continues to exert a very conservative view of the world and to fall behind a lot of the kind of very progressive, radical, and liberal initiatives within our society.
We have one more question, I believe, from Anonymous. Thank you for your presentation. Much of what you are talking about here, especially about evidence for epic narratives, is longstanding practice in pre-modern architectural historical scholarship. Is presentism a problem then in architectural history? Now, this goes back a little bit to what you were discussing previously.
Yeah, so this notion of emic narratives and the trying to recover the perspective of either minoritarian or subordinate groups within a society. I think, you know, I'm working with a few other architectural historians to produce a new history of American architecture that reads it as a settler colonial project and that understands it as a form of subordinating or eliting other forms of nationhood that could have influence within the field. And so within that kind of practice, the separation between the avant-garde and folk history or vernacular history or pre-modern history is crucial. You know, modern and modernity, modernity and modernism have to be understood as this kind of progressive project of the advanced world, of advanced societies, so that the lessons of the pre-modern or folk or vernacular societies are only need to be considered in reference to how, insofar as they can advance this avant-gardism.
Right.
But if the lesson we take from emic narratives is not that, their primitive worldview and ways of making are very good for sustainability, and so we need to look to them the way that we look to nature to understand how, like, the fly and the eagle and other forms of primitive nature, produces highly efficient, sustainable spaces. Like, it's not a kind of how can we jerry-rig or reductively read what they're doing to substantiate a technologically progressivist notion of the avant-garde. But the lesson that we take is that this notion is heavily biased and Eurocentric, and that what we need to do is to revise what we think modernity is, to recover alternative modes and subjectivities of modernity in the world. Then I think we no longer have a kind of division. And so, but for me, I don't think that presentism is the problem. I think it's a combination of historical amnesia. Like, we literally make the archive empty so that there isn't the evidence that would lead us in a different direction. But then a kind of overly futurist or utopian perspective of what we think the architect does and what architecture's role in society is. If we were really focused on the present, then we will be focusing on issues like climate change. We will be focusing on issues like racial equity and economic inequality, like the most pressing issues of today. No matter who you ask, and all the leading scientists and social theorists and social scientists, etc., they will tell you that the most pressing need is not for more technology. It's not for shinier, more formally innovative buildings. That's not on anybody's radar. It has to do with ameliorating certain excesses that have come along with the globalization of a particular view of modernism as consumer culture, as an extension of consumer capitalism, as a globalization of a particular kind of practice that people believe that if you just invent more widgets, you can design your way out of it. And we need to get out of that habit in so many ways. And I think that correcting the problems and the critical assumptions of modernism as we've inherited them become the problem. So I don't think presentism is the real problem. I think that people have defined the present incorrectly by a poor retrospective view and an overly utopian view that pushes everything that could be meaningful to these emic narratives out of the way. And I think that changing that lens, but using the apparatus that's in place, could be quite useful for people who want to focus on those problems.
I think with that is our final question, and we would like to thank you so much, Professor Davis, for joining us, for leaving us with many thought-provoking parts of your discussion that I'm sure we'll continue to discuss in-house amongst ourselves here. And we greatly appreciate your time. Obviously, I know that you have many things on your plate right now, and obviously we are very interested in seeing what further scholarship comes from your offerings.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah.
As well as the invitation to think on the theme that you have, disciplinary foundations and institutional change.
Yes, we are looking forward to we're looking forward to the other two presentations, and as I mentioned at the very beginning, again, I'm going to repeat this because as I mentioned at the very beginning, and I know a lot of people weren't online at that time, we will actually also be convening in a roundtable discussion after the 3 lectures that ConCave has organized for this series. And of course, whoever wants to join is very welcome to join in the roundtable discussion around these themes that we hope will elicit further ideas about how we structure architectural education. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you
for
so much.
more information on the series Questioning Disciplinary Foundation, you can visit ConCave's website. It's concavegt.com, and we'll keep updating our website.
Okay. With that, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody who attended as well, for all your questions.